My fiancé's phone rang during our wedding vows with a wildly romantic, spicy sound. The church was quiet in that soft, anticipatory way that only happens during weddings, when everyone is holding their breath and smiling through happy tears. I stood at the altar in a white dress that suddenly felt heavier than it had an hour earlier, my hands trembling slightly as I looked into Ryan's eyes. He was smiling at me with that familiar warmth that had convinced me, over and over again, that I was safe with him. Tears blurred my vision as he began his vows, his voice steady as he talked about destiny and timing and how I was the center of his universe. I remember thinking that this was the moment everything in my life finally made sense. Then his phone rang. It wasn't a subtle vibration or a gentle chime. It was loud, unmistakable, and deeply inappropriate. Pony by Genuine blasted through the church, the bass echoing off the walls like a bad joke played at the worst possible moment. Conversations stopped. Chairs creaked as people shifted. Every face turned toward us. Ryan's smile vanished instantly, replaced by something close to panic. His skin drained of color as he fumbled at his jacket pocket, the song continuing far longer than it should have before he finally silenced it. The quiet that followed was worse than the music. I stared at him, my heart pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. I asked who had called, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't meet my eyes when he said it was probably a wrong number or spam. I told him that wasn't true, that you don't assign a song like that by accident. I asked him to show me his phone. He pulled it closer to his chest instead, whispering that we should just continue, that we were already here. I shook my head and stepped back, gathering my dress in my hands as I walked away from the altar. My legs felt weak, but adrenaline kept me moving. Ryan followed me into the lobby, his parents and mine trailing behind, the ceremony dissolving into confusion behind us. I asked him outright if there was another woman. He swore there wasn't, his voice cracking. Before he could say more, his mother pushed forward, insisting it was his cousin, Rebecca, calling from overseas. She stumbled through an explanation about an old joke tied to the ringtone, but it didn't land. It sounded rehearsed and hollow. I told her it was disgusting to lie like that, and I reached for Ryan's phone again. He jerked his hand away, and the phone slipped from his grip, sailing into the decorative fountain by the entrance. The screen went dark as it hit the water. To my shock, Ryan looked relieved. That was when my best friend Sarah stepped in, her voice sharp as she pointed out that nobody would be happy. Their phone was destroyed if there was nothing to hide. I told Ryan I needed the truth, right then, or the wedding was over. He stood there shaking, staring at the floor. After a few agonizing seconds, he told me the caller was a woman named Megan. He said she was the mother of his child. The words didn't make sense at first, like they were spoken in another language. He explained he had a 4-year-old son and had never told me. My family reacted instantly, voices rising, but all I could focus on was the ringing in my ears. I asked why she had that ringtone, and he said it was old, that he'd said it years ago and forgotten about it. I told him that didn't explain his panic. That was when he admitted that 3 months earlier, Megan had moved back to town and they'd slept together. My father surged forward, furious, but my brothers held him back. Someone asked why she would call on our wedding day, and Ryan's mother answered for him, saying Megan was pregnant. My knees gave out. Sarah caught me before I hit the floor. I asked for Megan's number, my voice eerily calm, and Ryan gave it to me without protest. I called her on speaker. The lobby went completely silent as she answered. I told her who I was and where I was standing. There was a long pause before she spoke again, sounding tired but firm. She said she wasn't pregnant. She said she'd called to warn me because Ryan had been telling people she was, using it as an excuse to stay in her life. She said he'd been showing up at her apartment for months, talking about being a family again, and she'd told him she would call me if he didn't stop. When I asked if anything else was true, she didn't hesitate. The child was real. The affair was real. I ended the call and looked at Ryan, who immediately started talking, reaching for me like that might fix things. I stepped away. I told him the wedding was off. His mother began crying loudly, his father dragging him toward the exit as my family closed ranks around me. Sarah helped me out of the church, and I realized I was still wearing my wedding dress as we got into her car. She didn't ask where I wanted to go. She just drove. We ended up at a diner, the kind with cracked vinyl booths and endless coffee refills. I sat there in full bridal makeup, mascara streaking down my face, eating pancakes in the middle of the afternoon while strangers tried not to stare. The waitress didn't say anything, just kept my mug full. Sarah sat across from me and asked what I needed. I told her I needed to understand how I hadn't seen any of it. She told me I hadn't missed anything, that Ryan had hidden it. As I sat there, I replayed the last 2 years in my head. Every time his phone buzzed and he stepped away. Every trip that lasted longer than it should have. The way his mother sometimes looked at me with something that felt like guilt instead of warmth. They had all known. I finished my pancakes and walked out into the parking lot, my dress dragging across the gravel. When Sarah asked what came next, I looked down at the fabric I'd spent months choosing and said that once I took it off, I was never looking back. Sarah's apartment felt smaller than the place I had shared with Ryan, but the moment I stepped inside, it felt safer. The quiet there was different, not heavy with secrets or unfinished conversations. I sat on her gray couch, still in my wedding dress, staring at the coffee table without really seeing it. My phone buzzed relentlessly beside me, lighting up with Ryan's name again and again. Then my mom's, my dad's, and numbers I didn't recognize. I flipped the phone face down, but the vibration still pulsed through the cushion and into my palm. Like it was demanding attention I didn't have the strength to give. Sarah brought me a glass of water and placed it gently in front of me. I didn't touch it. She sat across from me, saying nothing, letting the silence exist without trying to fix it. I focused on the beading on my dress, remembering how many dresses I'd tried on before choosing this one. 17. Ryan had come to one of the fittings, breaking tradition because he said he couldn't wait to see me. I'd felt so loved then. Now I wondered if he'd been texting Megan the whole time while I smiled at my reflection. My phone buzzed again, and against my better judgment I turned it over. Ryan's face stared back at me from the screen. The photo from our mountain trip last fall. I remembered taking that picture just after he told me he loved me for the first time. My hand shook as I held down the power button until the screen went black. The dress suddenly felt too tight, like it was pressing in on my chest. I reached behind me for the zipper, but my fingers wouldn't cooperate. Sarah stood up without me asking and unzipped it slowly. As the fabric loosened, I felt like I could breathe for the first time in hours. I stepped out of the dress and stood there in my underwear, staring at the heap of white fabric pooled on the floor. Sarah picked it up carefully, smoothing the wrinkles, folding it as if it still mattered. Watching her handle it so gently made my throat ache. I sat back down on the couch and pulled a blanket over my legs. She set the folded dress on a chair and sat beside me. We didn't talk. Time slipped by unnoticed as the clock ticked past 7, then 8, then 9. My thoughts kept circling back to the same moments. Ryan taking calls in other rooms. Late nights he blamed on work or family emergencies. The way his mother had looked at me during dinners, like she was holding something back. They'd all known he had a son. They'd watched me plan a wedding and smiled through it. Megan's voice echoed in my head, calm and tired, not bitter or dramatic. She sounded like someone who had been dealing with Ryan's lies for years and was simply worn down by them. I wondered what their child knew, if he knew his dad was supposed to get married that day. Around midnight. Sarah brought me sweatpants and a t-shirt. I changed, and the dress stayed folded on the chair like a ghost of a life I almost had. She asked if I wanted to talk, and once I started, everything spilled out. The business trip that ran 2 days long. The time I surprised Ryan at his office and he seemed irritated instead of happy. How he always kept his phone face down. I believed every excuse because trusting him felt normal. Hearing the words out loud made them sound ridiculous. But at the time they hadn't. Sarah didn't interrupt or try to soften anything. She just listened. By 3 in the morning, I ran out of words. My eyes felt dry and scratchy, too exhausted to cry anymore. She handed me a pillow and another blanket, and I lay down on the couch. When she went to her bedroom and closed the door softly, I stared at the ceiling, watching shadows from the streetlight drift across the paint. That morning, I'd woken up excited to get married. Now my entire future looked unrecognizable. Sunlight woke me through the living room window. My neck ached and my mouth tasted stale. For a moment, I forgot everything. Then it all crashed back at once. I powered my phone back on. 17 missed calls. 12 from Ryan. 3 from his mother. 2 from my mom. Texts filled the screen. I opened the one from Ryan's mom first. Something about misunderstandings and giving Ryan a chance to explain. I deleted it without replying. Ryan's messages were long and desperate, full of apologies and promises. I didn't read them all. Sarah emerged from her room in a robe and asked if I'd checked my phone. I nodded. She started making coffee, the smell instantly bringing back memories of quiet Sunday mornings with Ryan, reading news articles and talking about nothing important. Now I couldn't tell which parts of that life had been real and which had been performance. My dad called asking where I was. I told him I was at Sarah's. He said he and my mom were coming over. When they arrived, my mom hugged me so tightly I could barely breathe. My dad hovered behind her, jaw clenched. They told me Ryan's family had called them the night before, talking about misunderstandings. My mom had shut it down, telling them there was nothing unclear about lying, cheating, and hiding a child. An hour later, my brothers showed up with garbage bags filled with my belongings. They'd gone to the church and then to the apartment while Ryan was out. They told me he'd come home while they were packing but hadn't spoken to him. I thanked them, overwhelmed by gratitude and exhaustion. Looking at the bags piled in Sarah's entryway made my chest tighten. It was my life reduced to trash bags. Sarah helped me sort through everything. My brothers had grabbed things randomly. Shoes without the ones I wore most. Shirts but no jeans. My laptop without the charger. I found a framed photo of Ryan and me from Christmas and set it face down before continuing. By afternoon, I knew I couldn't avoid the practical fallout any longer. I found a notebook and started making a list of everything that needed to be canceled. The venue, catering, flowers, flights, the apartment lease. The list kept growing. Each line another reminder of the future I'd planned. When I reached the bottom of the page, I added one more line about the dress alterations I'd already paid for. I put the pen down and pressed my hands to my face. Sarah looked at the list and suggested I call the wedding planner first, reminding me I didn't have to handle everything alone. The realization felt like a small lifeline. I called and explained the wedding was canceled. She spoke softly, said she'd heard what happened, and offered to handle contacting vendors. When we hung up, a tiny bit of the pressure lifted from my chest. That evening, as I tried to write a short statement for the vendors, the intercom buzzed. I heard Ryan's voice through the speaker, pleading to talk. Sarah told him to leave and threatened to call the police when he didn't stop. I felt nothing listening to him beg. When she hung up, I stared at my phone, reread his texts, and finally sent one message setting boundaries. When he immediately called anyway, I blocked his number. The silence afterward felt powerful in a way I hadn't expected. Lying in bed that night, I realized this was the first decision I'd made entirely for myself in a long time. The next morning, my phone rang while I was still half asleep on Sarah's couch. The number wasn't saved, and for a second I considered letting it go to voicemail. Something made me answer anyway. A woman introduced herself as the manager of the wedding venue. She said my planner had reached out, but she wanted to speak to me personally. I sat up, bracing myself. She explained that the deposit was non-refundable because of the contract, but they were willing to apply the amount to a future event within a year. I laughed before I could stop myself, a sharp, bitter sound that surprised us both. I told her I wouldn't be needing that option and thanked her for calling. After hanging up, I felt shaky all over again. The idea of walking back into that venue, even for a different event, made my stomach turn. Sarah sat with me at the kitchen table as I spread out contracts and receipts, the numbers blurring together. Each agreement was clear and unforgiving. Deposits lost. Fees owed. Dreams itemized in black ink. By noon, I knew I needed help, so I called my cousin Lauren, a lawyer who specialized in contracts. She told me to come by her office that afternoon. Getting dressed in real clothes felt strange after days in borrowed comfort. The bus ride downtown dragged on forever, my thoughts bouncing between anger and numbness. Lauren hugged me when I arrived, then settled across from me with a legal pad and reading glasses. She went through every contract carefully, making notes as she went. After a while, she looked up and told me the truth plainly. Most of the vendors were protected by solid cancellation clauses. I was likely out around $15,000. The number hit me like a punch to the chest. Lauren squeezed my hand and asked if I wanted to pursue any legal action against Ryan. I thought about courtrooms and depositions and seeing his face over and over again. I shook my head. I told her I just wanted to be done. She nodded, unsurprised, and still gave me information about my options in case I changed my mind. She refused to charge me, saying family doesn't bill family. I left her office feeling both grateful and defeated. 3 days after the wedding that never happened, I went back to work. Staying at Sarah's had been a lifeline, but hiding there forever wasn't an option. My boss greeted me kindly and reminded me I could take more time if I needed it. I told her I wanted the distraction. Sitting at my desk, trying to focus on emails while my hands shook, felt surreal. Around mid-morning, a coworker stopped by and asked how married life was treating me. I told her the wedding had been canceled at the altar. The shock on her face mirrored reactions I'd already seen too many times. The rest of the day crawled. People either avoided me or looked at me with pity. I was exhausted by the time I got home. That evening, I received a message on social media from a man named Ethan. Someone I recognized from photos with Ryan back in college. My first instinct was to ignore it, assuming he wanted to defend Ryan. Instead, his message said he needed to talk and promised he wasn't reaching out to make excuses. Something about his tone felt sincere, so after a long pause, I agreed to meet him at a coffee shop downtown. The next afternoon, Ethan was already there, nervously stirring his drink. He thanked me for coming and admitted he'd been feeling guilty for months. He told me Ryan had mentioned Megan and the child last year, talking as if it was something I already knew. Ethan said he'd even asked Ryan once how I felt about the situation, and Ryan had brushed it off, saying we were handling it together. Ethan only realized the truth when he heard about the wedding falling apart at the altar. Listening to him talk made my skin feel cold. He told me Ryan used to compare me and Megan in conversations, talking about what he got from each of us like it was normal. At the time, Ethan had assumed Ryan was talking about a past relationship. Now it was clear he'd been describing 2 active ones. When I asked if the affair had really only happened once, Ethan hesitated. He admitted Ryan had mentioned seeing Megan multiple times over the past year under the guise of co-parenting. The realization settled heavily in my chest. Ethan explained why he'd reached out now. Ryan had called him recently, angry about being exposed, complaining about how unfairly he'd been treated. There was no remorse, just frustration at being caught. That was when Ethan decided he couldn't stay silent. I thanked him for telling me, even though every word made things hurt more. Walking home, I realized the betrayal ran deeper than I'd allowed myself to believe. That night, sleep wouldn't come. I scrolled through old photos of Ryan and me, noticing details I'd ignored before. His phone angled away, smiles that didn't quite reach his eyes, moments that felt off in hindsight. Sarah sat with me, reminding me that trusting someone isn't a flaw. Lying is. I wanted to believe her, even though guilt still clung to me. A few days later, I had to return to the apartment Ryan and I had shared to divide our belongings. The building looked the same, but walking inside felt like stepping into a crime scene. Ryan was already there, standing when he saw me, arms half open. I stepped back immediately. Sarah positioned herself between us, her presence steady and protective. We rode the elevator in silence. Inside the apartment, everything felt tainted. Ryan tried to talk, explaining he'd been scared I'd leave if I knew about his son. I told him I could have handled the truth. What I couldn't handle was 2 years of lies and cheating months before our wedding. When he tried to justify sleeping with Megan by calling her emotional, Sarah shut him down sharply. He finally went quiet. We spent hours sorting through things. I took what was clearly mine and left everything we'd chosen together. Each object felt like evidence of a relationship that hadn't been real. When he offered me the coffee maker we'd bought on vacation, I snapped that I didn't want anything that would remind me of him every morning. By the time we were done, I had 3 boxes. 2 years reduced to 3 boxes. That evening, my mom called to tell me Ryan's mother had suggested a meeting between our families. I almost laughed. My mom shut it down immediately. Hearing that made me feel protected in a way I hadn't realized I needed. Still, sleep continued to evade me. The memory of the altar replaying in my head. Sarah suggested therapy, and I made an appointment with a therapist named Dr. Helen Brooks. In our first session, she asked what I needed to feel safe again. The question caught me off guard. I talked about the constant replaying of that moment, the urge to blame myself. She gently redirected my anger back where it belonged, reminding me that deception says everything about the liar, not the person being lied to. I left feeling lighter, like I'd been given permission to stop punishing myself. 2 days later, the photographer emailed, expecting full payment. I forwarded it to the planner, who negotiated a reduced rate. It wasn't ideal, but it helped. That night, I made the mistake of checking social media. Ryan had posted about learning from mistakes, gathering sympathy from people who didn't know the truth. I felt my blood pressure rise but closed the app instead of engaging. He didn't deserve my energy anymore. At Sarah's suggestion, I wrote everything I wanted to say to Ryan in a notebook. 7 pages of anger, grief, and questions poured out of me. When I was done, we burned the pages in her fireplace. Watching the words turn to ash felt strangely freeing. Lunch with my dad later that week reminded me I wasn't alone. He apologized for not seeing through Ryan, and I told him Ryan had fooled everyone. Talking about normal things afterward helped ground me again. When I ran into one of Ryan's cousins at the grocery store and she tried to tell me he was struggling, I finally said what I'd been holding back. Mistakes aren't hiding a child or stalking an ex. Walking away from that conversation left my hands shaking, but I was proud I'd spoken up. That night, the planner called with final numbers, $12,000 lost. I stared at the wall afterward, doing mental math, then decided Ryan should take responsibility. I emailed him calmly, asking for half. His response blamed financial stress and framed my request as punishment. Furious, I called Lauren and asked her to send a formal demand letter. A week later, Ryan's father offered to pay part of the amount to settle things. I accepted, wanting closure more than justice. When the check arrived, I deposited it without reading the note. I was done looking backward. Once the financial dust settled, I realized staying at Sarah's place indefinitely wasn't fair. No matter how many times she insisted it was fine, I needed my own space. Somewhere that didn't carry the weight of someone else's generosity or the echo of a life that had imploded. I started scrolling through apartment listings late at night, comparing rent prices and commute times, bookmarking places that looked decent and deleting the ones that felt depressing. Most options were either too expensive, too far from work, or clearly hiding problems behind clever photography. After a few days of searching, I found a small one-bedroom about 20 minutes from my office. It was more expensive than I wanted. Nearly $200 more than what I'd paid when I lived with Ryan, but it was available immediately. The building looked clean, the reviews were decent, and the photos showed large windows that let in a lot of light. I scheduled a viewing for the next afternoon, telling myself I was just looking, not committing to anything. The apartment was smaller than I'd imagined. The kitchen barely fit 2 people, and the bathroom was so narrow I could touch both walls at once. But the bedroom was bright, and sunlight spilled across the floor in a way that made the space feel warm instead of cramped. Standing there alone, I felt something shift. It wasn't excitement exactly, but it was relief. Before I could talk myself out of it, I put down the deposit. Walking back to the bus stop, my hands were shaking, but for the first time in weeks, the fear felt mixed with something like hope. Moving in 2 weeks later was both terrifying and freeing. It was the first time I'd lived alone in years. Ryan and I had moved in together after 6 months of dating, a decision that seemed romantic at the time and reckless in hindsight. Claire no, Sarand, my brothers helped me move the few things I'd taken from the old apartment. We carried boxes up 3 flights of stairs because the building didn't have an elevator. My oldest brother cracking jokes about how light everything was. He wasn't wrong. I'd left behind almost everything we'd bought together. We painted the bedroom first. A deep blue-green color that Ryan would have hated. He'd always insisted neutral walls made a space feel calm. Watching the color spread across the white felt symbolic, like reclaiming small choices that had quietly been taken from me. I bought 3 plants from the hardware store, the kind that needed regular watering. Ryan had always complained plants were too much work. Setting them on the windowsill felt like a small rebellion. My next session with Dr. Helen Brooks happened the day after I finished unpacking. She asked how I felt about the apartment, and I told her it felt strange but good. Then I admitted something that had been weighing on me. I said I felt like I'd wasted 2 years of my life on someone who never deserved them. She didn't rush to reassure me. Instead, she asked why I thought those years were wasted. I struggled to answer, finally saying I could have been building a life with someone honest instead. She reframed it gently. She said those years taught me what I actually needed in a partner, and what red flags I could no longer ignore. She said I'd learned I was strong enough to walk away even when it was painful in public. I wasn't fully convinced yet, but the idea lodged itself somewhere in my chest. Maybe those years weren't a loss. Maybe they were tuition for lessons I wouldn't forget. 3 weeks into living alone, I woke up one morning and realized I'd slept through the entire night. No jolting awake at 3 a.m., no replaying the moment Ryan's phone rang. I lay there staring at the ceiling, stunned by the realization. The day before had been ordinary. Work, dinner, a show, bed. Not once had I thought about Ryan. It felt small and monumental at the same time. A few days later, Megan reached out on social media, asking if we could talk. I stared at the message for a long time before replying. Part of me wanted to ignore it and keep moving forward. Another part needed to understand how deeply Ryan's lies had run. I agreed to meet her for coffee. She was already seated when I arrived, looking nervous and tired. She apologized immediately, saying she hadn't known Ryan was engaged until she saw the wedding announcement online. She told me he'd shown up at her apartment months earlier, talking about wanting to be more involved as a father. He'd acted single, focused on becoming a better person. She admitted she'd been hopeful, wanting their son to have a present parent. Listening to her, everything clicked into place. She explained how Ryan had pursued her for weeks before they slept together, how she'd regretted it immediately, how he'd grown pushy afterward. When she described him using their son as an excuse to stay in her life, anger flared hot and sharp. We talked for nearly 2 hours, comparing notes, realizing how carefully he'd manipulated both of us. Walking home afterward, I felt strangely validated. It hadn't been one mistake. It had been a pattern. Around that time, friends started inviting me out again, cautiously at first. One night at dinner, I made a joke about at least getting a good story out of my canceled wedding. Laughter broke the tension, and suddenly the night felt lighter. We laughed about the absurdity of the ringtone, the fountain, the terrible lie about the cousin. For the first time, the memory didn't feel like a wound. It felt like a story I was reclaiming. The following Monday, my boss called me into her office. I assumed something was wrong. Instead, she told me I'd gotten the promotion I'd applied for months earlier. The decision was based entirely on my work, not sympathy. The news hit me like a burst of light. For so long, my identity had been tangled up in Ryan and our future plans. This promotion was proof that my life was bigger than that. That night, I found an email from Ryan sitting unread in my inbox. The subject line asked if we could talk. I read it out of curiosity more than anything else. He wrote about growth and reflection, about wanting to explain himself. I felt nothing reading it, not anger or sadness, just exhaustion. I deleted it without replying. The finality surprised me. Sarah tried setting me up with someone a week later, a man named Daniel who worked in accounting. We met for coffee. He was polite, punctual, and honest about wanting something casual. There was no spark, but sitting across from him reminded me I could exist in that space again. When we said goodbye, I felt lighter simply for having tried. In therapy, Dr. Brooks asked me what I wanted my life to look like now. I didn't know how to answer. So much of my planning had revolved around Ryan's preferences. She handed me a notebook and told me to write down things I'd wanted that he'd dismissed. The list started small and grew quickly. Bright colors, art classes, traveling alone, maybe a dog. Seeing it written out made me angry at myself, but also determined. I signed up for a pottery class at a community center near my apartment. Ryan had mocked the idea years ago. Sitting at the wheel, hands covered in clay, failing repeatedly and laughing with strangers, felt grounding. My first bowl leaned awkwardly to one side. But I loved it because I'd made it without anyone telling me it was impractical. One Saturday at the gym, I noticed a couple in the park setting up for wedding photos. Months earlier, it would have broken me. Instead, I felt relief that I wasn't tied to someone who couldn't be honest. The realization caught me off guard. Healing had been happening quietly, without my permission. Ethan texted to say he'd run into Ryan at a party. Ryan had been telling people we broke up because we wanted different things. I laughed at the audacity and told Ethan I didn't care what story Ryan told as long as he stayed away from me. I meant it. I booked a solo weekend trip to a small beach town Ryan had once called boring. Driving there alone felt empowering. I spent hours on the beach with a book, ate dinner by myself, watched the sun sink into the ocean. Nobody expected anything from me. The peace I felt was real and unforced. Back in the city, Dr. Brooks pointed out I was smiling more, carrying less tension. She was right. The constant anxiety I'd lived with had faded. When Megan later told me Ryan's attempt for increased custody had been denied, I felt relief rather than vindication. His patterns were catching up to him. 6 months after the altar disaster, Sarah and I met for dinner. She reminded me of that afternoon in the diner, how broken I'd been. Looking at my life now, my apartment, my job, my peace, felt surreal. I raised my glass and realized I was no longer just surviving. I was building something new. A few weeks after that dinner with Sarah, I ran into Ryan's father at the hardware store. I was standing in the paint aisle, comparing shades of blue for a small accent wall in my living room, when I noticed him a few feet away holding a can of wood stain like he wasn't sure what to do with it. Our eyes met, and there was no pretending not to recognize each other. He set the can down and walked over, his posture stiff, his expression heavy with something that looked like regret. He told me he was sorry for everything his son had put me through. The words sounded practiced, but his eyes were tired, and I believed he meant them. I thanked him for helping cover part of the wedding losses and surprised myself by saying I was doing well. It wasn't a lie. He nodded, visibly relieved, as if that answer released him from something he'd been carrying. We stood there for a few seconds in awkward silence before he excused himself and walked away. I finished my shopping feeling lighter than I expected. Like another loose thread had finally been cut. Not long after that, my youngest brother called me one evening and asked if we could meet for coffee. His voice sounded nervous, which immediately put me on edge. When we sat down, he fidgeted with his cup before blurting out that he'd proposed to his girlfriend, Hannah, and she'd said yes. The smile on his face was unmistakable. Then his expression shifted, and he asked carefully if I would be okay being around wedding planning after everything that had happened to me. I reached across the table and took his hand without hesitation. I told him I was genuinely happy for him and that my experience wasn't going to cast a shadow over his joy. The relief on his face made my chest ache. We spent the rest of the evening scrolling through venue photos on his phone, talking about guest lists and food options, and I felt nothing but warmth for him. Seeing real uncomplicated happiness up close reminded me that what I'd lost wasn't love itself, just a version of it that had been built on lies. A week later, my boss asked me to find some old photos from a company retreat we'd had 2 years earlier. I opened my laptop and started digging through folders when I stumbled across a series of pictures from the early days of my relationship with Ryan. There we were at a restaurant on our third date, smiling too brightly. Another photo showed us on a beach trip where he'd told me he was falling for me. I waited for the familiar ache to hit, but it didn't. Instead, it felt like looking at strangers. I mentioned it to Dr. Helen Brooks during my next session, and she smiled softly, telling me that indifference was often the truest sign of moving on. One Saturday morning, I sat in my favorite chair by the window, the one with bright blue cushions Ryan used to complain about. Sunlight streamed in, warming my face as I sipped coffee and watched people walk their dogs in the park across the street. My apartment was quiet, exactly the way I liked it. I realized I didn't have anywhere I needed to be or anyone I needed to check in with. My schedule, my space, my choices were all mine. The wedding that never happened had felt like the end of everything at the time. Now it felt like the beginning. Megan texted me again a few days later, asking if I wanted to catch up. We met for coffee near my apartment, and she told me the court had denied Ryan's request for increased custody. The judge had questioned his sudden interest in parenting so soon after our wedding fell apart. Megan seemed relieved, exhausted, and a little vindicated. She said Ryan had been angry, blaming her for the outcome, unable to see his own role in it. Hearing that, I felt no satisfaction, only confirmation. Patterns don't disappear just because someone wants them to. As months passed, my life settled into something steady and unexpectedly fulfilling. Work was busy but rewarding. My pottery class became a weekly ritual I genuinely looked forward to. The crooked bowl I'd made on my first day sat on my kitchen counter, holding keys and spare change, a small reminder that imperfect things could still be meaningful. I traveled alone when I felt like it, tried restaurants Ryan would have dismissed, filled my apartment with colors and plants that made me happy. One evening, Sarah and I met for dinner again, laughing about nothing important. She raised her glass and told me she was proud of me, not just for surviving what happened, but for refusing to let it define me. I realized she was right. I didn't recognize the woman I'd been 6 months earlier, crying in a wedding dress at a diner, convinced her life was over. That version of me had been shattered, but from that break, something stronger had grown. I stopped checking Ryan's social media entirely. When mutual acquaintances mentioned him in passing, it barely registered. Ethan texted once more to say he hoped I was doing well, and I thanked him for being honest when it mattered. That chapter of my life felt closed, not with drama or final words, but with quiet certainty. One afternoon, while repainting a small section of my living room, I caught my reflection in the mirror. I looked different, not physically, but in the way I carried myself. There was a calm there that hadn't existed before. I understood now that love without honesty isn't love at all, and that trusting someone who betrays that trust doesn't make you foolish. It makes you human. On a slow Sunday morning, I sat by the window again with my coffee, listening to the city wake up. I thought about how far I'd come from that moment at the altar when everything collapsed in front of hundreds of people. Back then, it felt like humiliation and heartbreak were the only things waiting for me. I couldn't have imagined this version of my life, one built entirely on my own terms. I smiled to myself, grateful not for what I'd lost, but for what I'd gained: independence, clarity, peace. The story that once felt like the worst thing that could have happened to me had quietly become the best thing that ever did.